Hello, P Street family, and whoever else might be joining us for tonight's Bible class. We just finished a series of lessons entitled Postcards from Heaven last week. We ended with Jude, and I realized that I think somewhere towards the first of that lesson, I thought, man, I think I'm going to get done, in less than an hour, but I don't think that's what happened, and I apologize. I got a problem when it comes maybe to doing too much study and talking maybe too long. But we're going to move on to something new tonight. We're going to think about. We're going to spend 4 Sunday nights considering the book of Jonah. And it might be hard to see the subtitles, so let me blow this up for you here. Peeved Preacher, Gracious God. And it's really going to take us probably to the end of the book to truly pick up on that first part, Peeved Preacher. But I think even in tonight's lesson, we realize that we do serve a gracious God. And that Jonah did too. He just struggled with that. At least with who God was wanting to be gracious towards and to show mercy to. But all of that will eventually come to light. If you like word plays, if you like irony and humor and foreshadowing, surprises, you're going to love the book. If it's something you haven't studied before in any in-depth, you're going to love this book. It is a literary masterpiece of 4 chapters, 48 verses. Now, most people, when they think about the book of Jonah, they think it's a book about a big fish that swallowed a man named Jonah who was running away from God. It's really a story about why Jonah was attempting to run from God. That's what this book is essentially about. But you actually have to wait until the discussion of the 4th chapter to learn why Jonah was running away from God, or we ought to say attempting to do so. So there's a sense in which this is a slow burner that's heading towards a pretty amazing conclusion, maybe even an unexpected one. But that's at least 3 or 4 weeks away. Here's, in fact, what we want to try to accomplish tonight. We're going to get through Jonah 1. I think tonight's lesson will be the longest of the 4. We've got more verses to deal with, and I do want to kind of walk you through it. There's a lot of, peculiarities in the text, things you would have questions about that I want to try to give you at least some idea of what's going on and provide some explanation, even though someone might have a different one. But I've done what I can to make sense of the text here and there. We'll do Jonah 2, December 13th, Jonah 3, December 20th, and then coming off of Christmas Day and that weekend, we will kind of end the weekend talking about Jonah chapter 4. Here is something I've put together, adapted it from Walton and Hill's book, Old Testament Today, but it's just a nice little outline that I like to use when thinking about the time period of the prophets. So the prophets are listed there on the left, and you got the time periods. And I'm not really trying to put exact dates on this, although some of these are probably easier to date than others. But let's just say this. Jonah was from Gath Hepher. That's Hepher. That city was located a few miles north of Nazareth. Thus he was from Galilee. He preached in the northern kingdom in the days of Jeroboam II, predicting victories over Syria. And you can find his name, in fact, Jonah, son of Amittai. You can see him in 2 Kings 14:25. You can read of him there. And it was a time of peace and prosperity. And Jonah was probably esteemed rather highly. Jonah was a contemporary. You can see this from our little chart here. He was a contemporary of Amos and Hosea. You'll see him in that second box on the left there, the darker orange. He was a contemporary of Amos and Hosea. He was a pre-exilic prophet. That means he prophesied before the Babylonian captivity. In fact, he even prophesied prior to the Assyrian captivity. It'd be another 50 or 60 years after Jonah's time when Assyria would take the northern kingdom into captivity. So you need to file that away, okay? And even during this time, even in these days, Assyria was considered an enemy, not a friend. And Assyria was arguably the cruelest empire in ancient history. I've seen some presentations on Assyria, and you would be disgusted and disturbed by what they would do to those they conquered. So Jonah, this is where we would situate him historically. Here are some things about the book that are unique, that make it in some sense, one of a kind. It is primarily about a prophet and not prophecies or a prophecy. Actually, it only takes, I think, about 5 words in Hebrew to relate the prophecy of Jonah. So this book is unique among the minor prophets because it's about the prophet and not so much about what the prophet had to prophesy. It's the only minor prophet primarily in prose or narrative, means it's telling a story, again, about the prophet's life. The only Old Testament character took a trip on the Mediterranean. He's the only minor prophet where the miraculous plays a role. The only minor prophet mentioned by Jesus. And in fact, Jesus will liken Jonah to himself, being in the belly of the whale 3 days, 3 nights. So here is the points, about 6 points here. Could add maybe 1 or 2 more, but this will suffice. That kind of shows you the uniqueness of this book. Now, let's look at what I like to label this chapter, and you will see a kind of a theme of this unexpected theme running through my outline of Jonah. But I call chapter 1 the unexpected reluctance of a commissioned prophet. Okay, it's wordy, yes. There's some other outlines that exist out there, some that are, I guess, quite famous. Jonah runs from God, and Jonah runs to God, and all of these things. But here's sort of my take on the first chapter, unexpected reluctance of a commissioned prophet. So what we're going to do is we are going to work through the text. I'll have the text in front of you here, and I'll just make some comments along the way, highlight some things for you, make some connections for you, ask you some questions, kind of walk you through it. We'll have a statement at the end from J.W. McGarvey that I think gives us a nice little preaching point to wrap chapter 1 up, and then we'll be on to chapter 2 next week. Okay, so here we go. I'll be able to bring this up here and kind of keep my face in front of you, whether or not you want my face in front of you or not. It's going to be there as we work through the text. Okay, so here we go. Here's how Jonah starts. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. All right, here's what you got to know. This is real important. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. And we just talked about Assyria, didn't we? And about 50 or 60 years into the future here, Assyria would take that northern kingdom, those 10 tribes in the north, into captivity. And that kingdom, so to speak, would never exist again, okay? And Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And even at this time, we cannot say that the Jews and the Assyrians were on good terms. So there's a sense in which, Jonah is being sent to his enemies, all right, to their great city. In fact, Nineveh is among the oldest, this city is among the oldest of civilization, extending back, it's believed, shortly after the Great Flood. The circumference of the city within the walls was 8 miles. And then you had the suburbs outside of those walls. And according to, some historians, Nineveh at this time was demoralized, was in a depressed state because of internal as well as external conflict, which, could argue that God's timing here wasn't accidental, that perhaps Nineveh, because of where that city was at, would have been more susceptible to hearing a word from Yahweh, from the Lord. And let me say this. This will be something we can come back to later, but Jonah needed Nineveh as much as Nineveh needed Jonah. File that away. That's a good thought, especially if you're familiar with all that this story has to share with you here. Jonah needed Nineveh as much as Nineveh needed Jonah. Now, as we studied in our postcards from heaven, we got to Obadiah. Obadiah was writing prophecy essentially against the Edomites. One of the points we made is that God was not just the God of Israel, the God of all nations. Israel was, yes, a chosen people, but it was through them that the nations of the earth were to be blessed. And so God, was as concerned about Nineveh as any other city. Nineveh was just as subject to his scrutiny, to his concern, to his sovereignty, and to his judgment as Israel was, as Jerusalem was. This is God is the God of all nations ultimately. And Jonah reminds us of this point. Here's verse 3. We might have expected to get an "and" here, right? And Jonah, he listened to the word of the Lord, and he went to Nineveh as the Lord commanded. But that's not what we get. Instead, we get but. But Jonah, he rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare, and he went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. So instead of an "and," we get a "but." And I would argue that this is kind of unexpected. This is unusual because, when you think about the prophets, God's commissioned prophets, they stand ready to speak the mind of God to the people, right? That's what they're there for. And so it is strange that Jonah does not obey God. Jonah actually does the opposite of what God is commanding him. He goes in the complete opposite direction of God's commanded destination. Tarshish was in the opposite direction of Nineveh. Now, even at this juncture, those of us who are readers, Bible students, know that Jonah is embarking on an impossible anti-quest. There twice in verse 3, it says that he is essentially trying to get away from the presence of the Lord. Jonah should have known, perhaps Jonah did know, that what he was doing here wasn't going to work. You can't run from God. You cannot hide from God. Jeremiah 23 verses 23 through 24 read, "Am I a God at hand, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord?" The answers to these questions, the first question is that, am I a God that's just near but not far? Well, absolutely. You're near and you're far, right? And can a man hide himself in secret places? No. God is omnipresent. God is omniscient. And surely Jonah knew that there was nowhere he could go that God wasn't already there. And now Jonah, he might have realized this fact, but because of his distaste for the work that he was being called to, I guess, maybe he was gonna make an attempt, even though the attempt was quite foolish. But he sets out to do just that. And you wouldn't know it from just a reading of verse 3 alone, but the phrase "went down" is used in several places between chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Jonah. So Jonah has embarked on his own mission, a.k.a. Operation AWOL, and he's gone to the west and all of that, but there's a sense in which he's actually going further and further down. So he went down to Joppa there in verse 3. Joppa was about 55 to 60 miles from his hometown. So it would have been a bit of a journey just to get to Joppa. And then we got him going down into the ship. And then in verse 5, we'll have him having gone below deck into the ship. And then in chapter 2, verse 6, it talks about him going down into the depths of the sea, only for God to raise him up. But that's a neat little wordplay or use of language in the first couple of chapters of Jonah that I think is interesting to point out. Here's a map. Let me take my face off of this so you can see this. So Nineveh was about 500 to 550 miles east of Jerusalem, Palestine. Tarshish was about 2,000 to 2,500 miles west of Palestine. So if we wanted to put this sort of like in a modern setting that for those of us here in America we could appreciate, it would be like what Jonah did would be like God coming to me and saying, "Jacob, I want you to go to Durham, North Carolina and preach to the people there." And then I respond by actually going all the way to Fresno, California. That's about what Jonah's trying to do here, okay? You go to Nineveh, he says, "No, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Tarshish." If you're looking at the map, he's trying to get as far away from Nineveh as he possibly can. Now, chapter 1 actually doesn't tell us why Jonah made the decision to flee to Tarshish and avoid Nineveh. It doesn't tell us. As I've already mentioned, you're not going to find that out till chapter 4. But what I like to do here is I like to speculate. For me, having studied the book, Let's just act like we don't know what's coming. We got questions. He said, go to Nineveh. Jonah said no. Okay, well, what are some possible reasons? Well, maybe Jonah's petrified. I mean, after all, Nineveh was a formidable city, known for its brutality in battle. The Assyrians were cruel conquerors. Maybe he's just scared, you know? Perhaps Jonah was pessimistic, right? After all, what are the chances of a city like Nineveh changing its ways? What are the chances that Nineveh would repent? Or maybe Jonah is prejudiced. I mean, after all, the people of Nineveh are Israel's enemies. We'll see. We come to Jonah 4 and 5. So here's what God does in response to Jonah's anti-quest. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. And the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. This word hurled shows up a few times. God hurled a great wind upon the sea. Verse 5, it causes the sailors not only to hurl their cargo into the sea, but eventually later in verse 15, they're going to hurl Jonah himself into the sea. Chapter 2, as we'll see next week, God is said to be the one who hurled Jonah into the sea. You see this here, the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. Patron deities, family deities, were rarely cosmic deities in that sort of polytheistic context of the ancient Near Eastern world. The Jews were unique for being monotheistic, that there's one God, not a plurality of gods of varying levels and power. And so in this polytheistic context, one could generally identify divine activity, at least in their minds. But it was another matter altogether to discover which God was acting and why. The sailors called out to their gods in the hope that one of their patron deities might be able to exert some influence on whichever god has become disturbed enough to send the storm. So they're calling out for assistance. They're not repenting. Okay, they're calling out for assistance, and they're thinking the more context they can make with their respective gods, the better their chances are. So they're just calling out. And then we get verses 5 and 6, the second part of verse 5 and verse 6. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. You got this massive storm, and Jonah is just snoozing away. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? How can you be sleeping right now? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." Perhaps Jonah was asleep because he was exhausted. As we said, that travel from his hometown to Joppa would have taken it out of him. And then there's that stress of that decision to flee from the Lord, which, yes, is an impossibility, but Jonah's doing it, at least attempting to. And perhaps the fact that Jonah's asleep tells us that maybe he felt justified, in going to Tarshish instead of Nineveh. Perhaps he feels completely justified. His conscience is good. He's not disturbed. That's speculation. I do find it ironic, though, that you got this pagan shipmaster who has to rouse this prophet of the Lord from his sleep and admonish him to call out to his God. Again, they want everybody praying to their respective gods because the more context, the better. And then verses 7 and 8. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell to Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" Now, this whole casting lots business is fascinating. I've been fascinated before. I'll continue to be fascinated by it. Now, it is true that the casting of lots was sometimes used to allow the deity to communicate. We see that in the Old Testament with the high priest. And many instances, though, there's the other way you could kind of use this. It could be more like coin flipping, drawing straws. So the possibility exists that the lots were not cast here to determine who was guilty, but to decide who would be first to volunteer information about themselves that might expose an offense against some god. It's understandable that no one would be eager to go first. And so the view of some is that when they say let's cast lots, again, this would be like drawing straws, and whoever got the short straw, so to speak, is the one that's going to have to kind of go first and answer a litany of questions. Of course, on the other hand, this could be an instance from Proverbs, where Proverbs 16:33 comes into play, which reads, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." And so we think about the casting of lots for the new apostle in Acts, and then it falls to Matthias. Okay, did in this element of chance, did God make his desire known? And is that in fact what's happening here? And the other thing that's difficult about the casting of lots is we're not real sure what that looked like. It's possible that each supplied an identifiable marker. The markers are placed in a container and shaken, and the one that comes out, whoever's marker that is, that's who the lot falls to. Others think it was a combination of, a white stone and several black stones, and everybody pulls a stone, and whoever gets the white stone is, There's a lot of speculation because the text doesn't tell us exactly the method of casting lots here. So you got a couple options, as to what they were hoping to accomplish by the casting of lots. Nevertheless, isn't it interesting? The lot falls to Jonah, and those of us who are readers, we know that Jonah is the culprit. And they got questions. Now, in reply to their questions, Jonah only identifies his ethnic association, Hebrew, and he also identifies the God that he serves. So notice in verse 9, "And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Okay, so what's most significant, I think, about Jonah's response here is the way he describes the Lord. He describes the Lord as this cosmic creator deity, which is just the type of God who would be capable of sending such a storm. at least in the mind of these polytheistic mariners. Maybe they have their little family gods, their little patron deities of their city or something, and but here Jonah begins to describe the God that he serves, and they're like, well, that's a big old powerful God who could very well be the one that is who's doing this. And they're afraid. Notice their fear goes to another level. Jonah had evidently told them earlier what he was doing. Perhaps he's like, here, I'm paying the fare. I'm trying to run away from my God, and maybe, they're thinking that's your problem. It's possible that it wasn't necessarily all that uncommon, but their terror increases because they realize that Jonah's flight from a cosmic deity has put them all in jeopardy. And, they like Jonah, are going to suffer the wrath of Jonah's God. Now, for me, another thing about Jonah's response here is there's a fierce irony here. Jonah says, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord. Really, Jonah? You really fear the Lord? Well, then it's like, why are you in this predicament then? If you really feared the Lord, you wouldn't be in this predicament. In fact, you would have obeyed the Lord. You would have gone to Nineveh, not gotten a boat down in Joppa, and started making your way over to Tarshish. So Jonah has a grasp of orthodox theology, okay? But his practice hadn't been matching his profession, right? There's the irony in that, I think, in the way that he identifies himself and his relationship to this God. And so they said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea, and the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. The sailors are inquiring about appeasement. Okay? In the religious thinking of the ancient world, the people rarely thought in terms of repentance. Okay? The motives of the gods could not be easily discerned. The gods were, in this polytheistic context, were neither moral or consistent. Their anger might be entirely whimsical. It could be capricious. The acts of punishment arbitrary or childish, and that is so different from the God of the Bible, the God who really exists. He is not capricious and whimsical like these mariners would have thought of their litany of gods. And so the worshipers, these mariners, they thought in terms of appeasing the God's anger. And different gods might be appeased in different ways. So they asked Jonah, what shall we do? What should we do? Now, some find Jonah's response here admirable. Isn't Jonah being a whole lot like Christ here? He's willing to die that they might live. And so some are really, patting Jonah on the back in verse 12. But others, and I'm more inclined to get in this other camp, others are less inclined to praise Jonah. After all, it appears that Jonah would actually prefer death to completing the task that God has assigned to him. Maybe Jonah left out thinking, I ain't getting out of this alive. Jonah, he knew he was maybe setting out on an impossible anti-quest, his Operation AWOL, and he's thinking, this probably is not going to end all that well, and maybe he was good with that. Here he's just like, just throw me overboard. I'll die. You guys will live. But, Jonah Jonah shouldn't even be in this predicament. Again, he shouldn't be here, should not be in this situation. And he's become a curse rather than a blessing to his pagan shipmates. Now, the men, look at this. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land. They were reluctant to follow Jonah's advice. Perhaps they were among those who believed that deities, were protective of the lives of their worshipers, and they were worried that if they throw Jonah overboard, they might get in trouble with this God of Jonah's. So they row hard. They're trying to save Jonah's life. They couldn't do it. The sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. Now, they decide they can't save Jonah. They're going to have to throw Jonah overboard. And so they're basically praying a prayer of forgiveness before they do what was probably inevitable. They were going to have to do something to save themselves. They've already thrown everything overboard. They've jettisoned all their cargo. And now they're like, hey, I guess we do have to take Jonah's advice here, or do what Jonah says. And so that's what they do. They ask for God's forgiveness prior to throwing Jonah in the stormy sea. And then verses 15 and 16 to kind of bring chapter 1 to a close. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. Now, there's some irony in this too, right? I mean, these pagan sailors respond better to the Lord than Jonah, who is God's own appointed prophet. Now, we do have some questions here. What kind of sacrifice did they offer out there on that boat? Some think it was probably a grain offering, probably not a burnt offering on a wooden ship. And perhaps this grain offering was just thrown into the sea. Alternatively, since all the cargo had, I guess, been jettisoned and thrown overboard, it may be, some have suggested that it refers to a sacrifice that was made on their return to dry land. It seems to me after throwing Jonah overboard, there was no need to go to Tarshish, unless for whatever reason they had their own reasons for going there. But we're not sure about the nature of the sacrifice and the vow. About the vow, we can only speculate. Maybe they vowed to offer a memorial sacrifice of some sort to Jonah's God each year on the anniversary of this event. The vows acknowledged that the sailors had experienced some sort of divine power. But the question is the text mean to suggest here that they have abandoned all of their gods and now they are monotheistic in their faith? The text doesn't say that. It wasn't real hard for a lot of polytheistic minded people to add other gods to sort of their ring of honor, okay? And so it would be probably going too far to say that these men converted to the Lord. But it is at least in this context of their behavior and sort of worship to the Lord, and gratefulness to the Lord. It is it just stands in stark contrast to the behavior of God's own commissioned prophet. So here's where I want to sort of close our discussion. If you were to have your Bible out, okay, for as we were going through this, you will notice that in your English Bible there is a verse 17. And I think it's an unfortunate chapter division. I think verse 17 belongs with chapter 2. And if I had been the one breaking the Bible up into chapters and verses years ago, that's what I would have done. And in fact, the Hebrew Bible, okay, the one that's in Hebrew, it puts chapter 1:17 in our English Bibles is actually chapter 2, verse 1. So I'm going to follow the Hebrew Bible, and I'm going to keep 1:17 with chapter 2. So we will pick up with 1:17 next week. So with that in mind, chapter 1 leaves us asking the question, will Jonah drown at sea? We hadn't gone to 2, 3, 4 yet. I like to play that. Imagine you're a first-time reader. You got no prior knowledge. Chapter 1 leaves you asking that question. What's going to happen to Jonah? You know, he's just been thrown into the stormy sea. It stops storming about the time he gets in the water, but that's got to be creepy. It's scary. So what's going to happen to him? Does Jonah deserve to die at sea, you think? I mean, after all, he has blatantly disobeyed a direct command from the God of heaven and earth. So make no mistake, God would have been justified in letting Jonah drown in the Mediterranean. He would have been. But the question lingers as to whether that's what God is going to do. So as we close, I told you we would end with a quote from J.W. McGarvey. He wrote a book entitled Jesus and Jonah, and on page 54 he says, Jonah learned, and through his valuable experience millions have learned, that when God enjoins a disagreeable duty, it is far easier to go and do it than to run away from it. I like those words. So maybe that's a good little lesson for us to take away from our study of Jonah chapter 1. When God lays on us something and we're confronted in His Word with something that might be difficult, that we might want to spurn or avoid in some way, it's so much better to do it than to run away from it. Always. So, with that, we bring our study of Jonah 1 to an end. Next Sunday night, we will look at Jonah chapter 2. Jonah chapter 1 was the unexpected reluctance of a commissioned prophet. And we'll have something equally unexpected happening in Jonah chapter 2. Thanks for watching.